Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we discussed about Redis cache and Apache Kafka. Redis cache is used to maintain distributed cache for our applications to reduce number of round trips between Java application and the database. We are using Redis cache. Redis cache will maintain the data in the form of key value pair. It will maintain the data in the form of key value pair. The next one, Apache Kafka. Apache Kafka we are using as distributed streaming platform. If we want to exchange the data from one application to another application, we will use Apache Kafka. Apache Kafka we are using as a mediator between two applications. We can also say that Apache Kafka is a message broker. Apache Kafka works based on pub and sub model. One application will act as a publisher, another application will act as a subscriber. One application will act as a publisher, another application will act as a subscriber. Are you guys clear with this point? Perfect. So today we are going to understand. Today we are going to understand the most important concept in microservices, that is config server. Today we are going to talk about one most important concept in the microservices, that is called Spring Cloud config server. Config server is used to externalize application configuration properties. Config server is used to externalize application configuration properties. Application configuration properties. Example, data source properties, data source properties, data source properties, application actuator properties, actuator properties, security properties, security properties, SMTP properties, SMTP properties, Kafka properties, application messages, etc. When we are developing a project, now you see in our project we are having some properties. Application properties file will be available in this application.properties file. For example, if you take API gateway, in the API gateway we have created one YML file. In this YML we have configured routings, application name, application port number. We have configured in this YML file. Now whenever you configure these properties, these are called configuration properties. When you configure these properties within this YML, now we are going to deploy this application as a jar file. We are going to deploy this application as a jar file. Are you guys getting my point? Once you package your application as a jar file, once you package your application as a jar file, can we change those properties in future? Once we deploy this application as a jar file, can we change those properties in future? Guys, can we change those properties in future? Is it possible or it is not possible? Can we change those properties in the future? Is it possible or it is not possible? It is not possible because the properties are also included in the jar file. Is that a recommended approach to package properties also in the jar file? Spring Boot applications will be packaged as a jar file. Spring Boot applications will be packaged as a jar file. Now, configuration properties also available in this jar file. In future, if I want to change anything, then I need to change that YML. I need to package my application again, and I need to deploy my application. So is that the recommended approach to keep configuration properties within the application, or it is not recommended to keep the properties within the application? Come on guys, could you please respond? Is it recommended to configure application properties within the application? As part of our application development, we will use several configuration properties. As of now, we configured those configuration properties in application.properties file or in application.yml file. Excuse me, guys. As part of our application development, we will use several configuration properties. As of now, we configured those configuration properties within application properties are application.yml. Application.properties are application.yml file. YML file will be available within the project. When we package our boot application for deployment, our configuration properties will be part of that packaged file. If we want to change any configuration properties, then we have to package our application again, and we have to redeploy our application. This is not recommended. Are you able to understand what is the problem if you keep your configuration properties within application.properties or application.yml? Keeping the configuration properties within the project is recommended. Keeping the configuration properties outside the project is recommended. To avoid this problem, we will keep configuration properties outside of the project. To avoid this problem, we will keep configuration properties outside of the project. So to keep these configuration properties outside of the project, we are going to use config server. As part of our application development, we will use several configuration properties like this. Okay. As part of our application development, we will use several configuration properties. Example, data source properties, actuator properties, security properties, SMTP properties, Kafka properties, application messages, etc. As of now, we configured those properties in applicational properties file or application.yml. Now, if you see, we developed our applications. We developed our applications, right? Crowd operations applications we have developed. In this crowd operation application, what we have done? Data source properties we have configured within application net properties. H2 database properties I configured within my application net properties file. Now tomorrow I want to change these properties. So tomorrow I want to change these properties. Now I need to change this data in the properties file, and I need to package my application again, and I need to deploy my application. So that is time taking process and it is not recommended. As of now we configured those configuration properties in the properties file or in the YML file. That properties file or YML file will be available within the project. So when we package our boot application for deployment, our configuration properties will be part of that packaged file. Our properties file will be part of that packaged file. So once it is packaged as a jar file, now see here, when I'm going to deploy my application is packaged as a jar file like this. My project is packaged as a jar file like this. So tomorrow I want to change the data source properties. Can I change directly in this jar file? Can I change directly in this jar file, guys? Then what should I do? I need to go to my project properties file. I need to change this. And again, I need to package my application. Again, I need to package my application. Once we package our application, again we need to redeploy our application. Again we need to redeploy our application. So in the real time, is it the recommended approach or it is not the recommended approach? It is not recommended approach. So what is the recommended approach? Keeping the configuration properties within the project is recommended. Keeping the configuration properties outside of the project is recommended. Keeping the configuration properties within the project is recommended. Keeping the configuration properties outside of the project is recommended. Keeping the configuration properties outside of the project is recommended. So which concept is available to keep the configuration properties outside of the project in the microservices? That's where config server comes into picture. That's where config server comes into picture. Config server is used to externalize application configuration properties. Using config server, we can load configuration properties from outside of the project. When we want to change any configuration properties, when we want to change any configuration properties, we no need to repackage and redeploy our application. We no need to repackage and redeploy our application. Using config server, we can loosely couple our application and configuration properties. Using config server, we can decouple our application and configuration properties. Loosely coupling our application and configuration properties will be loosely coupled. We can decouple application and configuration properties using config server. In layman terminology, in simple terminology, I can say config server is used to externalize application configuration properties. Config server is used to externalize application configuration properties. Using config server, we can load configuration properties from outside of the project. When we want to change any configuration properties, we no need to repackage and redeploy our application. Using config server, we can decouple our application and configuration properties. Are you guys comfortable? What is a config server? Are you guys comfortable with what is config server? Yeah. What is the main purpose of config server, guys? What is the main purpose of config server? What is the main purpose of config server? Come on. What is the main purpose of config server? What is the main purpose of config server? People are not responding. People are not responding. What is the purpose of config server? The application and application configuration properties will be loosely coupled. So config server, the main purpose of config server to separate configuration properties from the project. Configuration properties will be loaded from outside of the project. Okay, sir, how we are going to load this configuration properties? So here I'm going to maintain one GitHub repository to maintain config properties. What are the configuration properties required for our application? I'm going to maintain one GitHub repository. In GitHub repository, we can create our config properties. Suppose we are having a welcome API, welcome API.yml, welcome API.yml. We can say welcome is our API name, welcome.yml. Similarly, you have greet.yml. With the project name, we need to create our YML file. Suppose, for example, if you have a payment API, payment.yml. If you have a checkout API, checkout.yml. If you have a tracking API, tracking.yml. If you have cart API, cart.yml. If you have a admin API, admin.yml. If you have a reports API, reports.yml. Like this, with your API name, with your project name, you are going to create YML files. Those YML files contains properties. What are the properties we need for welcome API? Those properties we are going to keep in the welcome.yml. For our in our project, several microservices will be available. All the microservices needs some configuration properties. Instead of keeping the configuration properties within our project, we are going to externalize configuration properties. So where we are going to store the configuration properties? Configuration properties I'm storing in the GitHub repository. Sir, when you are storing in the GitHub repository, what should be the file name? The file name will be our project name. So now our project is a welcome API. Welcome API will be having welcome.yml. If you are using Greet API properties will be available in greet.yml. We have a payment API that will be available in the payment.yml. We have a admin API. Admin API properties will be available in admin.yml. We have the reports API. Reports API configuration properties available in the reports.yml. You can use profile also. What do you mean by profiles? So I can configure reports prod.yml. We already discussed, I think you have gone through the video of the profiles. You can maintain the profile specific configuration properties also in this GitHub repository. So for every project, configuration properties will be available. Those configuration properties, instead of keeping within the project, we are going to keep the configuration properties in the GitHub repository. Now, here we are going to create one project, that is config server. We are going to create one project which is config server. This config server is going to load the properties from this GitHub repository. Config server will be available. This config server is going to load the properties from GitHub repository. Now here our microservices will be available, that is Greet API, our welcome API, whatever it is there. Greet API, our welcome API, all the APIs will be loading the data. Greet API will be available and welcome API will be available. Payment API will be available. Cart API will be available. Admin API will be available. Reports API will be available. These all are our microservices. So for these microservices, configuration properties available in GitHub repository. So we are developing our application by using microservices. Now, for our microservices, configuration properties are available in GitHub repository. For our microservice, configuration properties available in GitHub repository. Now, our projects want to load the configuration properties. So our projects will be connected with the config server. Our projects will be connected with the config server for the configuration properties. Greet API, welcome API, payment API, cart API, admin API, and reports API. So all the microservices of our project will be connected with the config server. All the microservices in our project will be connected with the config server. This config server will connect with the GitHub repository. So like this, in the real time, we are going to externalize application configuration properties. We are going to externalize application configuration properties. Are you able to understand my point? Are you guys able to understand my point? So our microservices will be loading the configuration properties from our application or from config server. Our application will be loading the configuration properties from our application itself, or it will be loading from the config server. From the config server. Config server will load the properties from where? Config server will load the properties from where? Config server will load the properties from GitHub. So tomorrow, I want to change some properties related to my reports API. Tomorrow, I want to change some properties related to reports API. So do I need to touch the reports API, or I just need to change in the GitHub repository? Do I need to change anything in the reports API, or I need to change only reports.yml, which is available in the GitHub repository? I will change only the reports.yml, which is available in the GitHub repository. Do I need to repackage my application? Do I need to redeploy my application? Do I need to repackage my application? Do I need to redeploy my application? Not required, because configuration properties are outside of the project. Configuration properties are outside of the project. Are you clear? Are you clear with my point? Come on. Okay, let us start our application development now. Let us start our application development now. First, let me go to my GitHub. Let me go to my GitHub. In the GitHub, I have created config properties. I have created config properties. So let me delete this. Let me create once again. Delete this repository. I will create one GitHub repository to maintain configuration properties. Okay. New repository name. I'm going to maintain configuration properties, or I can maintain as a config properties. Okay. anything, a repository name. Now create repository. I created one GitHub repository. In this GitHub repository, I'm creating one file. Welcome.properties, or you can create welcome.yml. Anything is fine. Welcome.properties or welcome.yml. You can create it. Okay, guys. Now, suppose if I create welcome.yml. In this file, I will mention message welcome to Ashok IT. I am mentioning welcome to Ashok IT. Commit a new file. Now, I have created one file with a name called welcome.yml. Welcome.yml. This is my configuration properties. Okay. So now, what is my first step is create GitHub repository, and keep configuration properties in GitHub repo. Create GitHub repository and keep configuration properties in GitHub repo. Next one, create config server project. Create a config server project. Now see how I am going to create one config server project. Config server, it is used to connect with the GitHub repository. Config server is used to connect with the GitHub repository. So now let me create a config server. Let me create one config server, file, new, Spring Starter project, Spring Boot microservice, config server. It is just a config server project. For this config server project, what are the dependencies? So here I'm selecting the two dependencies. One is config server. So here you have two things, config server, config client. I'm going for config server and I'm using actuator also. Two dependencies I have selected. Okay, create config server project with below dependencies. So what are the dependencies I used? First one is config server. And the second one is actuator. Config server and actuator. All right. Now see the pom.xml. So I mentioned this as actuator dependency and I used Spring Cloud config server dependency. How to represent this application as a config server? For that, we are using one annotation called enable config server. I'm using one annotation at boot start class. That annotation is enable config server. This annotation will represent this application as a configuration server. This application will become a config server project with this annotation. Now, where are our configuration properties available? Where our configuration properties are available? Our configuration properties available in the GitHub. I need to tell to this config server my configuration properties are available in GitHub repository. I need to tell that I need to inform to this config server my application configuration properties are available in the GitHub repository. So in this config server, I'm going to specify the location of our GitHub repository. So spring.cloud.config.server.git.uri. What is the location of the configuration properties? Take our GitHub repository. Spring Cloud config server git URI, the location of our GitHub repository we are giving. Why? Config server should connect with the GitHub repository. config server should connect with the GitHub repository. That's why I gave the location of config properties in the GitHub to this my config server. Okay. After this, clone and start is equal to true. So whenever the config server started, I want this server to clone all the configuration property files available in GitHub repository, in the GitHub repository. So to this config server, I'm telling where the configuration properties are available using this git URI. This is the repository in the GitHub which contains my configuration properties. Clone and start. Whenever this configuration server started, I want this config server to clone all the property files available in the repository. And the next one, I'm going to disable a security for this. Management dot security dot management dot security dot enabled management dot security dot management dot security dot enabled is equal to false. So what is the meaning of this management dot security dot enabled is equal to false? So to connect to this config server, I want to disable that security part. Management dot security dot enabled is equal to false. Git URI of our configuration properties, clone and start is equal to true. Clone and start is equal to true. Okay. Now here config server application, config server project. So what we are going to do in the config server project, create Spring Boot application with below dependencies. This is our first step. Create config server project with below dependencies. Write enable config server annotation, enable config server annotation at boot start class, configure below properties in application.yml file. You can use applicational properties also. I'm using application.yml. So this is our config server project. Create a config server project with below dependencies. I used config server as a dependency. I used actuator dependency. So to represent this application as a config server, I am using enable config server annotation. Enable config server annotation at the boot start class. Once that is completed, then configure below properties in application.yml file. Spring Cloud config server git URI, clone on start is equal to true, management security enabled is equal to false. These are the properties we are writing. These are the properties we are writing. Once this part is completed, then we need to develop our microservice. Then we need to develop our actual microservice. We need to develop our actual microservice. Right. Before going to develop the microservice, let us test. Let us test this config server is working as expected or not. Is this config server working as expected or not? It is failed. If you are using a Git profile, you need to set a Git URI in your configuration. Okay. I think I need to update this project. Maven, update the project. Yeah, project updated. Run as boot app. I just created config server project and I'm trying to run this application. Application started with the port number 8080. Let's go to browser and check it. localhost colon 8080/welcome welcome/config. Yes. Are we able to load the welcome application configuration properties? Is my config server detecting welcome.yml and the messages which are the properties which are available in this welcome.yml? Is my config server working as expected? Welcome is my project name. With the project name, we will create a file /config. Is it able to detect my configuration properties in the GitHub repository? Is it able to detect the configuration properties? Is it able to detect? Yes, it is able to detect configuration properties. That's fine. Now the next step is create config server client project. Microservice to load config properties from config service. Microservice to load config properties using config server. We can say config server client, config client application. We can say this as a config server client application because this is our actual microservice in the project, which will load configuration properties from the config server. This is our actual microservice, which will load config properties from the config server. Config server is ready. That config server is connected with the GitHub repository where our configuration properties are available. Create Spring Boot starter. Create Spring starter. Create boot application with below dependencies. Create boot application with below dependencies. Okay. What are the dependencies? Config server client application. Then we will go with the web starter. Okay. Web starter, config client, Spring Cloud starter config client, web starter dependency we are going to use. Once it is done, then we need to configure 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 application name, application port, application name, application port, config server URL, application name, application port, config server URL, config server URL, etc. Name, port, config server URL, we need to configure. Guys, here we are going to use two things. One is bootstrap.yml, and the second one is application.yml. Two things will be available, bootstrap.yml and application.yml. I will tell you what is the difference between bootstrap.yml and application.yml. Create REST controller, create REST controller with required methods. Run the application and test it. Run the application and test it. Okay. So as of now, in our projects, we are using only application.yml. So then what is this bootstrap.yml? Application.yml file will be loaded after our application got started. Okay. If you want to load any properties as a bootstrapping properties at the time of application startup, I want to load some properties like when my project is getting started, I want to connect to the config server. Then config server URL you can configure in the bootstrap.yml. Your application port number and all you can configure in the application.yml. Are you guys getting my point? Any properties that you want to load before your application properties, you can configure them in the bootstrap.yml. So config server I'm going to configure in the bootstrap.yml. Remaining stuff you can configure in application.yml. So see the 4 steps. Microservice to load config properties using config server. Create boot application with below dependencies: config client and web starter. Create boot application with below dependencies: config client and web starter. Configure application name, application port, config server URL. So in this application, not one YML guys, 2 YML files will be available. One is actual application.yml, another one is bootstrap.yml. Config server.yml, config server URL will be available in the bootstrap.yml, bootstrap.yml, and the remaining stuff will be available in application.yml. So here we can enable profile also. You have gone through the profile. For every environment, separate configuration properties will be available. So which properties file should be loaded? It depends upon the profile that we are going to activate. All right. Let us create a client application. So before going to create the client application, are you clear with these 2 steps? Are you clear with these 2 steps? This is my Git repo. I created one GitHub repository with a name called any name. Name can be anything. Repository name can be anything. I created a repository with a name called configuration properties. Then in that, I created one file welcome.yml. In that file, I just stored one property, message welcome to Ashok IT. Then I created config server project. For that, create boot app with below dependencies. Create boot application with below dependencies, config server and actuator. In that project, I used this annotation, enable config server at the start class. At the start class, I used this annotation, write enable config server annotation at boot start class. Then configure below properties in application.yml file. Configure below properties in application.yml. What properties I am telling? What is our GitHub repository? GitHub repository where the configuration properties are available. I'm telling that, and I'm telling that clone on start is equal to true. Spring Cloud config server git URI, the location of our configuration properties. Clone on start is equal to true. Management security enabled is equal to false. Security enablement that I specified as false. All right. So these are the properties I am configuring. That means my config server is connected with the GitHub repository where our properties are available. Guys, one thing you need to keep in the mind, you need to create your properties file in the GitHub with your application name. If your application is a welcome, then it should be welcome.yml. If your application is a payment, then it should be payment.yml. If your application is a cart, it should be cart.yml. So you need to create a configuration properties YML with your application name, then only we can load that. All right, fine. Are you clear with this process? Are you clear with this process? Create GitHub repository and keep configuration properties in the GitHub repository. We need to use application name for configuration properties file name. We need to use application name for configuration properties or YML file name. example, welcome.yml. If you want to have the profile, welcome-dev.yml, welcome-prod.yml. Similarly, if you have admin, admin.yml, then admin-dev.yml, admin-prod.yml. These are profiles. If you are using reports, then it should be reports.yml, reports-dev.yml, reports-prod.yml. Are you getting my point? If you are writing configuration properties for welcome API, then welcome.yml default profile. If you want to use the dev profile, then welcome-dev.ym. Here welcome is my application name. You cannot use any other name. You need to maintain only application name. We need to use application name for configuration properties or YML. Okay. Welcome.file name, welcome.yml, welcome-dev.yml, welcome-prod.yml, admin.yml. That means it is admin API properties. These are reports API properties. So this is the repository URL where I am storing my application properties. Are you guys clear with this point? This is the most important concept. Creating GitHub repository, everybody can do. But what kind of files we need to keep in the GitHub repository? What is the naming convention we need to follow those for those files? That is the most important thing. Creating GitHub repository is easy. In that GitHub repository, what property files we need to keep? Application name dot extension. Extension can be dot properties or extension can be dot YML. Welcome API. For welcome API, I want configuration file, configuration properties file. It should be welcome.yml. I want to use the profiles concept. Welcome-dev.yml, welcome-prod.yml. I have a admin API, admin.yml, admin-dev.yml, admin-prod.yml. If you are having a reports API, for reports API, I need configuration properties. Reports.yml, reports-dev.yml, reports-prod.yml. So all these microservices configuration properties will be available in one GitHub repository. Same concept I'm using in my current project also. Same concept I'm using in my current project also. All the microservices related configuration properties will be available in one GitHub repository. So to load the properties from the GitHub repository, we have created config server project. For the config server project, I'm telling what is the URI of our GitHub repository where our configuration properties are available. We are telling here. Then we need to create our microservice. That microservice is responsible to load the properties using config server. So in these microservices, we are creating two YMLs. One is bootstrap.yml, another one is application.yml. What will be available in the bootstrap.yml? In the bootstrap.yml, we will specify application name and a config server, app name and a config server URL. These properties we are going to specify in the bootstrap.yml. Application name and config server URL we are going to specify in the bootstrap.yml. In the application YML, port number, profile, such kind of stuff you can keep in the application.yml. Create a REST controller with required methods, run the application and test it. Are you clear? Are you clear with the GitHub repository, naming convention for the files, config server project, and config client? Let us develop config client. Spring Starter project, config client app. So every microservice in the real time will act as a config client only because config server is available. We are developing our microservices. Every microservice that we develop will act as a client for config server. Every microservice that we develop will act as a client for config server. Okay, click on next. Let's select web starter because we need to develop a REST API. For that, we need web starter. Then here we have config client. I'm selecting config client. Next one, Spring Cloud Bootstrap to load these properties. To load these properties, we are using Bootstrap dependency, Cloud Bootstrap, config Bootstrap, Cloud Bootstrap, config client, web starter, Bootstrap dependency. I have selected 3 dependencies. Then finish. Config client application got created. Go to pom.xml. Now see here, Spring Boot Starter web dependency, Spring Cloud Starter dependency, Spring Cloud Starter config, Spring Cloud Starter config, Spring Cloud Starter config is there. This is a client. Spring Cloud Starter Bootstrap I need. Spring Cloud Starter Bootstrap I need. Boot Starter web, Spring Boot Starter web, Spring Cloud Starter Bootstrap, Spring Cloud Starter config. These are the dependencies. Once these dependencies are completed, then here we have application.properties. Let me convert that to application.yml. Along with this, I'm going to create one more file, that is my bootstrap.yml. That is my bootstrap.yml. In this bootstrap.yml, what we are going to specify, spring.application.name. What is the name? Welcome. Why? The file I created with a welcome, so it should be welcome. Then URL spring.cloud.config.uri. So what is the location of our config server? Config server is running in our machine with a port number 8080. Config server running in our machine with a port number 8080. Application name and a config server URL I configured in the bootstrap.yml. In the bootstrap.yml. In the application.yml, any other thing like actuator configuration or your profiles activation that you can specify in the application.yml. In the bootstrap.yml, application name, config server URL. Already my config server is running on the 8080, so I'm going to change the port number to 9090. This config server is running on the port number 8080. Config server running on the port number 8080. My welcome API running on the port number 9090. Both applications are running in the same machine, so that's why for config server I'm using default port, that is 8080. For welcome API I'm using port number as 9090. Perfect. Let us create one REST controller. New class welcome REST controller. Welcome REST controller. I'm keeping them in the package. So let us make it as a REST controller. I have only one variable. For that I will use string message. I will use @value. I will use @value message. Here I want to load this message property from config server. From the config server $message. Now public string get welcome message, return message. Whatever the message we are loading from config server, I just want to send that message as a response. So I want to mention refresh scope. Configuration should be refreshed at the runtime. Okay, so I no need to restart my server, just my configuration properties should be reloaded. Whenever we change the properties in the GitHub repository, those properties should be reloaded. So that's why I'm using one annotation called refresh scope. I'm using one annotation called refresh scope. Are you guys clear with my point? This is my REST controller. My REST controller is using one variable. For that variable, I'm using @value. For @value, I have given $of message. If this message available in the config server, load it. Otherwise, display this value. Config server not working. Sir, what is this colon value? If message available in the config server, load it. If this message not available in the config server, then display this default value. This is for getting actual value. If that actual key, if this is used to get the value based on the key. If this key is not available, then take this as a default. Take this as a default. All right. Now let's update this project, client project, update this project, force update. I have updated my client application. Now run as boot app, run as boot app. It is acting as a config client. It is acting as a config client. Application started with the port number 9090. Bootstrap property source. Yes, it connected to the configuration properties. It connected to, you see that the message is available. Fetching the config server, which is available in this location. It is able to connect to the config server. From the config server, it located the property source also. There is no profile enabled, so it is taking as a default profile. Let us make a request localhost colon 9090. Welcome to Ashok IT. Are we able to get that message? Are we able to get that message? Where this message is available? Did I hard code that message in my application? Did I hard code that message in my application? Welcome to Ashok IT. Where this message is available? This message is available in GitHub repository. How my application is getting that message from the GitHub repository file? How I am getting that message from GitHub repository? Is my welcome API directly connected to the GitHub repository, or my welcome API connected to only config server? My welcome API directly connected to GitHub repository. My welcome API connected to config server. My welcome API connected to config server. Where is the configuration to connect our API to config server? Bootstrap.yml. Suppose if I change this application name instead of welcome, if I change this application name, can it fetch the data from the welcome.yml? If I change this application name from welcome, can it fetch that? No. What is the relation between our application and the configuration properties? Application name is the relation. That is the most important part. In the bootstrap.yml, I specified Spring application name as a welcome. With that name, there is a YML. That's why it is able to fetch that message key value from the welcome.yml. Let me create one more file, create a new file. I'm creating one file with a name called greet.yml. Here also I will specify message as good morning. Here also I will specify the message as a good morning. Now there are two YMLs available. In both YMLs key is the same. Greet YML contains a message. Welcome YML also contains a message. When I send a request, it is getting the message from the greet YML, or it is getting the message from the welcome YML. It is getting the message from the greet YML or getting the message from the welcome YML. Welcome YML. Why it is getting the message from the welcome YML? Why not from the git YML? There are two YMLs available. Why it is fetching the data only from the welcome YML? Why not from the greet YML? Where is the mapping between our application and the configuration file? Application name. What is the name of the application name? My application name is a welcome. For example, I'm stopping my client application. If I give the application name as a greet, if I give the application name as a greet, then what will happen? I have given my application name as a greet. Then what will happen? Config server is running. Let me update my client project. Maven, update this project, force update. Now right click, run as boot app. Right click, run as boot app. Application started. Send a request. What message is coming now? Good morning is coming. That means it is loading greet YML. It is loading welcome YML. It is loading greet YML or it is loading welcome YML, greet YML. Why it is loading a greet YML now? Where I informed to my application that it should load greet YML. Application name. Application name will play the major role. Application name will play the major role. Are you guys clear with my point? The relation between our applications and configuration properties. In the real time, multiple microservices will be available. How these applications, how this config server will understand for which microservice, which YML should be loaded. How the config server will understand for which service, for which microservice, which YML should be loaded. Guys, come on. Based on the name. So configuring application name is important or it is optional in the real-time microservices. In the real-time microservices, configuring the application name is optional or it is mandatory. When you have config server, it is mandatory. When you have config server, it is mandatory. If you don't configure your application name, then it cannot understand from which YML it has to load the properties. So are we able to externalize configuration properties from our application now? Application is available here. Configuration properties are available here. Are we able to externalize application properties? Which concept we used to externalize our application properties? Which concept we used to externalize application properties? Config server. The most important concept in the microservices. Config server is used to externalize application configuration properties. First create one Git repository, store your properties. Then create a config server project. Then create your client application. Create your client application. Okay. Now bootstrap.yml, application.yml. In the bootstrap YML, I'm storing my application name and a config server URL. In the bootstrap.yml, I'm configuring my application name and a config server URL. In the application.yml, I'm just configuring my server port number. Okay, guys. So in the bootstrap.yml, I configured application name and URL. In the application.yml, I'm configuring server port. And this is my REST controller. This REST controller is used to load the data from the config server based on the key. Guys, can you tell me the reason why I am giving colon some data? Dollar of message is the key. Why I am giving colon this value? If this message is not available, if this key is not available, then this default value will come. If that key is not available, then default value will come. Okay, guys. Perfect. So I will upload these class notes. Please practice this config server before coming to tomorrow's session. Config server is very important. In every project, we will use this config server concept. In my project also, we have the same concept. All the microservices related properties will be available here. Config server project will be available. That config server will load the properties from GitHub. Our microservices will connect with this config server. Application name is very important. Application name is very important. Config server. Based on the application name only, it is going to identify from which YML it has to load the data. Got it. In the interview, they will ask you what is the difference between application.yml and bootstrap.yml. You tell them that bootstrap.yml is used to configure config server URL. In the bootstrap.yml, we are configuring application name and config server URL, so when the application is getting started, immediately it will fetch the data from the config server. Okay. Thank you guys. With this, I'm stopping for today. We'll continue in the tomorrow session.